Hi everybody, welcome to Afterburner. I'm Bill Whittle. Well, as I woke up this morning just before taping this, news reports were just coming in of a new horrific attack, this time in Mali. Mass murder of innocent civilians were reported, and just reading the headlines, I immediately thought it's Lutheran extremists likely, or perhaps some Buddhist gunman of some kind. Turns out the murderers were shouting Allahu Akbar as they went about their bloody business. I will say this for these Islamic terrorists: they are the least racist people on the planet. When it comes to cold-blooded slaughter of innocent civilians, they're willing to murder anybody, anywhere, regardless of race, creed, or national origin. Well, that's the world today, right? Just because someone is shouting Allahu Akbar doesn't mean someone's about to have their head cut off with a knife, but pretty much every time someone gets their head cut off with a knife, someone is shouting Allahu Akbar. When the horrific Paris attacks occurred, after the shock and horror started to subside, many people started asking if this were some kind of failure of intelligence. Was there a way to know that these attacks were going to take place, and was there a way to stop them? Well, as it turned out, the French did know that the attacks were going to occur and that there was a way to stop them. They've known that these attacks were coming days in advance of the shootings. How many days in advance? No one's exactly sure. 7,300 days, perhaps. That's 20 years. That's a pretty big failure of intelligence. Because it's been at least 20 years in France since these heavily Muslim enclaves called banlieues stopped being the home of new refugees trying to build a new life in the West and started to become ghettos of rage, shame, despair, and a growing sense of radicalism. The French social welfare state, you see, requires vast numbers of immigrants to make up for the declining birth rates associated with socialism all around the world. 4 people doing less for themselves can pay for one person's cradle-to-grave benefits, but one person cannot do the same for 4 others. So the base of this socialist Ponzi scheme had to be imported. Now, unfortunately, unemployed or maybe unemployable, unassimilated young Muslims with nothing to do were radicalized and started to, well, look, just so we don't cause any microaggressions that would require a trigger warning and disrupt anyone's safe spaces, they started to act out inappropriately. The failure of intelligence got a new tip only 3,600 days ago when these radicalized young Muslims decided to set France on fire back in 2005. They were kids then, they're adults now. What happened to them in terms of punishment for these crimes? Look, if it had just been nothing, that would have been a disaster, but they were rewarded, which was a catastrophe. They were rewarded not only by more benefits, but by more sympathy and indulgence and fear and ultimately more power. Now, recently, some French police went into one of these Muslim neighborhoods to arrest a few suspected rapists. Wanton rape and the murder of homosexuals being 2 of the radicalized Islamic multicultural values that leftists everywhere are so determined to defend. The police were assaulted with rocks, the police cars were smashed, and they hightailed it out of there to triumphant sounds of Allahu Akbar. And they didn't come back with tanks. Now, to the main point. If you're one of the vast majority of law-abiding moderate Muslims, and all you see all the time is this, the crime, the rapes, the chasing away of the police, the intimidation, the unanswered calls for Sharia, the blocking of streets in prayer weekly in direct contravention of the law, if you see a Europe that has its own clergymen suggesting that they remove the crosses from their churches because they might offend these Muslim savages, a Sweden that tells their women not to dress so provocatively or to walk in groups because of the cultural differences that's making Sweden the rape capital of the world at the hands of these animals. And especially if in your own neighborhood you see a magazine called Charlie Hebdo publishing cartoons and standing up for not some fringe tradition, but for freedom of speech and expression, the foundational idea and ethic of the West. And all these murderers get in return are displays of flowers and Twitter hashtags and perfectly lovely images of the Eiffel Tower as a peace sign. What message does that send to the moderates? Islam commits mass murder and the Western people are calling for peace? The radicals are telling them daily that the West is finished, it has a death wish, and that the radicals are going to win. Whose side of the story would you believe if you were one of the moderate Muslim families that want to live in peace and may be ashamed or mortified by all of this? Who, based on the evidence, do you think is going to prevail? If the West will not defend itself And with Western reptiles like fellow cartoonist Gary Trudeau and John Kerry saying that the Hebdo murders were somehow justified or at least understandable, what does that tell those moderate Muslims? The Hebdo massacre provided 300 days of warning for these most recent attacks. What kind of a failure of intelligence is that? Now, the left tells us that fighting back against the radicals will simply radicalize the middle. You know, here in the West, one of our most abundant and renewable resources is the ever-growing annual yield of museum-grade useful idiots. Not fighting back is what's radicalizing the middle. Take the raid that captured some of these murderers just a few days ago. Europe's first woman suicide bomber, Ait Boulassine, had been a party girl. She'd been out clubbing and drinking alcohol. She knew next to nothing about Islam. So why did she join these animals? Well, she joined because they were bold and they were daring and they were romantic and confident and because they believed in something, and mostly because nothing had happened to them in the past. They went around bragging about their victories and how they're going to conquer Europe and bring back the caliphate. They're heroes. Her cousin, the Paris attack mastermind, Abdelhamid Abouad, was one of those who was doing all the bragging and showing off. When the shooting was over on that raid, they thought that he'd escaped. They thought that he'd escaped because he'd been shot so many times and blown up with so many grenades that they had to use DNA just to identify him. Party jihadist Ait Boulassine's head and spine were blown out into the street when she detonated her explosive vest. And one of these jihadi heroes was led down the street naked from the waist down in handcuffs. Now, what kind of message do you think that sends to the moderates? How heroic and romantic do they look now that we're actually fighting back? And when I say we, of course, I mean the French, the British, and the Russian warriors, really the leaders of the entire Western world, with one notable and disgraceful exception. You know, we fought the Nazis, who'd never attained more than 50% of the vote in Germany before coming to power, but who had pulled 98% of the vote after they had radicalized the middle. And we defeated Germany in World War II. 7% of that country consisted of actual Nazi party members, but no one opposed them. Western liberal idiots just appeased them and excused them, with one notable and honorable exception. So the Nazis radicalized the middle and took over the country. And when we fought them, we didn't have to kill every German to do it. And contrary to the cowardice and moral inversion of today's American left, we didn't pull German families out of their homes here in America and beat them to death with tire irons either. Not fighting back is the failure of intelligence of the progressive left, led by their progressive president, the current Secretary of State, and the nominee for the Democrats in 2016. The rest of the world is not that stupid. Not anymore.